Hey Samwise7RPG, I don't think I've ever made a reply to one of your videos before. I could be wrong, but then again there is always a first time for everything. So, let's talk about love. Now you already covered some really important topics to do with this, like the fact that it's mostly male players at a table, so people are generally not comfortable playing that with their peers. You've also mentioned quite well that courtly love doesn't necessarily have to be something that goes to uncomfortable levels, although it might still be something that isn't very interesting to the players involved, at least with regard to who they're role-playing it with, or in what they want to be doing at their time. And of course there's also something to be considered with the other people at the table who may not be that interested in watching the courtly love scenes play out between one player and the GM or two different players. You've offered a great suggestion in terms of characters already being married and already having a family. This kind of skips the part that most male players don't want to see and allows that relationship to already exist and already be important, and I think it's a very good idea. And of course the family gives them a tie into the world as well. And playing through the relationship itself, maybe we could just skip to the later parts and make it probably a little bit more interesting from our own perspective. But I did want to bring up a couple of games that do tackle this, because there are some that do. And the first one I want to mention is Kagamatsu. And Kagamatsu, to play Kagamatsu you need to have one female player and several male players. The female player is playing a male Ronin named Kagamatsu, and the male players are playing the village women who are trying to convince Kagamatsu to stay in that town, and are usually trying to have him fall in love with them, or to simply love them in a more platonic sense. Now, this is a very difficult game to play, and I can say that from personal experience. It's really hard to play some village woman in a feudal Japanese setting who has absolutely no power, and I personally make it a note to avoid playing any type of a female stereotype, which makes it very challenging because you're playing a character who has basically no power. But that's moving away from the whole romance aspect of things. There is a romantic element, and I often find that people will introduce humor if they want to avoid getting too emotionally attached to it. This has to do with frames, which I've discussed before. And there is sex involved in that specifically, like there is a certain point where you have sex with Kagamatsu, and there is, I believe, a desperation move that you can pull if you've done that, where you can claim that you are carrying his child. That may or may not work. It's kind of complicated with the rules. But it's definitely involving romance as one of the only things that you as a player, one of the male players, really roll the dice on. We can compare that with another game that handles relationships. It was A Mutual Decision. And this is actually a game about a breakup. The relationship is assumed to be already going at the start of the game and will end throughout the game. It has some other elements involved too, but this one is intentionally taking the point that stories that happen to be about romance almost always end with the couple moving into a monogamous relationship, and it solves all their problems and they're happy forever. And of course what they needed in their life was somebody of the opposite sex to fix them. And it's intentionally moving away from that, which is unsurprising of Ron Edwards. Now, what I do like about this is the fact that that relationship ends. We get to watch it fall apart. And no matter what the players do, they cannot save it. That's what the game's about. But again, that handles a relationship, and it handles a relationship failing, which is another thing that we just don't see. So that's another interesting game to play if you're really interested in bringing romance into your gaming table. The final ones I want to mention are Fiasco and Apocalypse World, which neither distinctly say that they have relationships as a major part of it. Now, Fiasco does have in its playset, you could be married, let's say, to another person, or in some other type of relationship there. But what is more likely to come up is sex, because that's often a need in Fiasco to come up. Need to get laid with your ex-wife one last time, to call it whatever. And Apocalypse World does not specifically say, hey, this is a game about relationships and sex, but it has a statistical change in the character when they have sex. There is, when you have sex, this happens. And in some cases it can be advantageous or disadvantageous to yourself. Now, you could entirely ignore that, but the fact that it's there tells you that the game is often about relationships, which it is. The post-apocalyptic genre should be really about relationships in many ways. It should be about people coming together and making a new society for themselves, or whatever the case might be, but it should definitely be about the people's stories with each other. And that is a game that kind of puts that in your face. So if you want to approach this topic as well, those games can be an interesting way to do it without putting it at the forefront, the way something like Kagamatsu or It Was Mutual Decision does. Now, there are a lot of other games that do handle this in some ways. A classic example being that D&D has had books such as, there was a sex book at one point, the Book of Erotic Fiction. And it was a terrible way of dealing with this topic, but there it was. Personally, I think that simply adding stats to it isn't necessarily the best way to get a good result, rather. While Apocalypse World does say here's a statistical change, it reflects the relationship is what the change is about, as opposed to, the type of thing that you might see in books of erotic fiction that might talk about your sexual endurance, which I don't think really matters in the context of the game. And while it could matter sometimes in the context of a relationship, I think there's much, much more important factors that should be brought up rather than simply just what your constitution score turns into. Anyway, the main point of this is if you want to handle this, I recommend a game that handles it really, really well or not at all, and you just simply play it out. That's my thoughts on the matter. Excellent question, by the way.